Sarah Martinez had always been the smallest recruit in her police academy class, but what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination. At 24 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail and eyes that burned with fierce ambition. Growing up in a tough neighborhood in Detroit, she had watched her single mother work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Sarah promised herself she would never be powerless again. The police academy was everything she expected and more. Every morning began at 5 o'clock sharp with brutal physical training. The other recruits, mostly men who towered over her, would sometimes exchange glances when she struggled with certain exercises. But Sarah never complained, never asked for help, and never gave up. She studied harder than anyone else, memorizing every law, every procedure, every protocol, until she could recite them in her sleep. Sergeant Mike Thompson ran the Defensive Tactics Training Program. He was a mountain of a man, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, with 20 years of street experience and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless with recruits who couldn't measure up. His voice could shake the walls when he barked orders, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. Thompson had trained hundreds of officers over the years, and he took pride in weeding out those who wouldn't survive on the streets. From the first day, Thompson seemed to have it out for Sarah. While he pushed all the recruits hard, his criticism of her was particularly harsh. When she performed a takedown move correctly, he would find fault with her stance. When she improved her stance, he would criticize her timing. Other recruits began to whisper that Thompson was trying to force her to quit. The Academy's defensive tactics training was designed to prepare future officers for the worst-case scenarios they might face. Recruits learned hand-to-hand combat, weapon retention, and how to subdue suspects without causing unnecessary harm. The training was intense and often resulted in bruises, pulled muscles, and wounded pride. For Sarah, each session felt like a battle not just against her training partner, but against Thompson's obvious skepticism about her abilities. During one particularly challenging session, Thompson demonstrated a complex takedown technique on a volunteer recruit. The move required precise timing, proper leverage, and complete commitment. Sarah watched intently, memorizing every detail of foot placement and body mechanics. When Thompson called for volunteers to attempt the technique, Sarah's hand shot up immediately. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Martinez, you think you can handle this?" His tone carried clear doubt, and several recruits shifted uncomfortably. They all knew that volunteering to work directly with Thompson often meant becoming the subject of a very painful lesson. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied firmly, stepping forward without hesitation. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady and her chin up. She had learned early in life that showing fear only invited more aggression. The other recruits formed a circle around them, some clearly expecting to watch Sarah fail spectacularly. Thompson's demonstrations were legendary for their intensity, and more than one recruit had ended up on the ground questioning their career choice after working with him directly. Thompson began explaining the counter moves to the technique he had just demonstrated. His instruction was detailed and precise, but there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't expect Sarah to actually retain the information. As he spoke, Sarah focused completely on his words, blocking out the whispers and stares from her classmates. The technique involved reading an attacker's momentum and using it against them. It required split-second timing and the confidence to commit fully to the movement, even when facing someone much larger and stronger. Thompson explained that hesitation would result in failure, and failure on the street could mean death. As Thompson prepared to demonstrate the attack that Sarah would need to counter, the tension in the room was thick. Everyone knew this was about more than just learning a technique. This was Thompson's way of testing whether Sarah truly belonged in law enforcement, and Sarah knew that her entire future might depend on how she performed in the next few minutes. Thompson positioned himself across from Sarah, his massive frame casting a shadow over her small form. Remember, Martinez, he said with a slight smirk, in the real world, the bad guys won't go easy on you just because you're small. They'll try to use your size against you, and if you can't handle it, you'll end up hurt or worse. Sarah nodded, rolling her shoulders to loosen them up. She had spent countless hours in the gym outside of regular training, working on building functional strength and improving her technique. While she might never match Thompson's raw power, she had developed lightning-fast reflexes and an intuitive understanding of leverage and momentum. The room fell silent as Thompson began his approach. This wasn't going to be a gentle training exercise. Sarah could see in his eyes that he intended to test her limits, to push her to the breaking point and see if she would crack under pressure. Everything she had worked for, all the late nights studying and early morning workouts, had led to this moment. As Thompson moved toward her with the controlled aggression of a predator, Sarah felt time seemed to slow down. Every detail became crystal clear: the sound of his boots on the mat, the slight shift in his weight as he prepared to execute the takedown, the surprised expressions on her fellow recruits' faces as they realized this demonstration was about to become very real. Sarah knew that the next few seconds would determine whether she would graduate from the academy or be sent home in defeat. But more than that, she knew this moment would define who she was and what she was capable of achieving. As Thompson closed the distance between them, Sarah's mind became perfectly clear, and she prepared to fight for her future with everything she had. Thompson lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large man. His hands reached for Sarah's shoulders, intending to grab her and execute the powerful takedown he had just demonstrated. The move was designed to overwhelm an opponent through sheer force and momentum, driving them to the ground where size and weight would become decisive advantages. But Sarah didn't try to match his strength or resist his forward momentum. Instead, she did exactly what Thompson had taught her moments before. As his hands made contact with her shoulders, she stepped back and slightly to the side, allowing his force to carry him forward. At the precise moment when he was most committed to his attack, Sarah grabbed his right wrist and dropped her left shoulder low. What happened next stunned everyone in the room. Using Thompson's own momentum against him, Sarah executed a perfect hip toss. The massive sergeant, who had been charging forward with full confidence, suddenly found himself airborne. For a brief moment, time seemed suspended as his feet left the ground and his eyes widened in complete shock. Thompson hit the training mat with a tremendous crash that echoed through the entire gymnasium. The impact was so forceful that dust particles danced in the air, and several recruits instinctively stepped back. The man who had seemed invincible just seconds before was now flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling with a dazed expression. The silence that followed was deafening. 40 recruits stood frozen in place, their mouths hanging open as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah Martinez, the smallest person in their class, had just taken down Sergeant Thompson, the most feared instructor in the entire academy. Thompson lay there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. His face cycled through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and then something that might have been anger. Sarah remained in her ready stance, unsure whether the exercise was over or if Thompson would come at her again. Slowly, Thompson rolled over and got to his feet. His uniform was wrinkled, and there was a red mark on his back where he had impacted the mat. He brushed himself off methodically, his face unreadable as he processed what had just occurred. The other recruits watched nervously, expecting an explosion of anger at any moment. "Well," Thompson said finally, his voice carrying a tone that no one could quite interpret, "that was textbook." He looked directly at Sarah, studying her carefully. "You used my momentum, waited for the right moment, and committed fully to the technique, exactly like I taught you." Sarah wasn't sure if she should feel proud or terrified. Thompson's tone was neutral, but she had learned that his calmest moments often preceded his most brutal corrections. She maintained her stance and waited for whatever would come next. Thompson walked slowly around her, examining her form and positioning. "Martinez, what you just did was technically perfect, but do you understand what it means?" His question hung in the air, and Sarah could feel every eye in the room focused on her. "Sir, it means that size isn't everything if you use proper technique," Sarah replied carefully. "That's part of it," Thompson agreed. "But there's more. You just proved that you won't fold under pressure. When I came at you full force, you didn't panic, you didn't freeze up, and you didn't try to muscle your way out of trouble. You stayed calm and used your training." The other recruits began to relax slightly, sensing that Sarah wasn't about to be destroyed for her success. But Thompson wasn't finished with his lesson. "However," he continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "in the real world, suspects don't usually go down and stay down after one throw. They get angry, they get desperate, and they often become more dangerous. What you just did was impressive, but it was only the beginning of what could be a much longer fight." As if to prove his point, Thompson suddenly dropped low and swept Sarah's legs. She hit the mat hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Before she could recover, Thompson was on top of her, using his weight advantage to pin her down. His massive hands gripped her wrists, and his knees trapped her legs. "This is what happens next, Martinez," Thompson said, his face inches from hers. "You get one good move, maybe two if you're lucky, but then you're fighting someone bigger and stronger who's now angry and embarrassed. What's your plan now?" Sarah struggled against his grip, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Thompson's strength was overwhelming, and from this position, technique alone wouldn't be enough to escape. Her initial victory suddenly felt hollow as she realized how quickly the tables had turned. But Sarah had not survived growing up in one of Detroit's toughest neighborhoods by giving up when things got difficult. Her mind raced through every escape technique she had learned, every dirty trick she had seen on the street, every piece of advice her mother had given her about fighting back against bigger opponents. "I don't quit," Sarah said through gritted teeth, still struggling against Thompson's hold. "And I don't fight fair when my life depends on it." Thompson's eyebrows raised slightly. "Show me," he challenged. What happened next would be talked about for years in the academy. Sarah stopped struggling against Thompson's grip on her wrists and instead used her legs to hook behind his knee. At the same time, she tucked her chin and drove her head forward, not enough to seriously injure him, but enough to catch him off guard and make him shift his weight. The combination of moves created just enough space for Sarah to snake her arm free. Once she had one hand loose, she didn't try to punch or push Thompson off. Instead, she went for a pressure point just below his ear, applying precise force to a nerve cluster that her mother had taught her when she was just 12 years old. Thompson's entire left side went temporarily numb, and his grip loosened involuntarily. Sarah immediately rolled to her side and used an elbow strike to his solar plexus, followed by a knee that caught him in the ribs. Within seconds, she had extracted herself from what had seemed like an impossible position. Thompson rolled away from her, shaking his head to clear the numbness from the pressure point attack. When he looked at Sarah, who was back on her feet and ready for whatever came next, there was something new in his expression, something that looked almost like approval. "That," Thompson said as he slowly got to his feet, "was not academy training." "No, sir," Sarah admitted. "Street training. My mother taught me that bullies only understand one thing, that their victims can fight back harder than they can dish it out." Thompson studied her for a long moment, and the entire room held its breath. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Sometimes street training is exactly what keeps you alive out there. But remember, Martinez, every technique you use has to be justified in your report afterward. The streets taught you how to survive, but the academy will teach you how to do your job legally." The tension in the room began to ease as it became clear that Thompson was not angry about Sarah's unconventional tactics. In fact, he seemed genuinely impressed by her adaptability and refusal to accept defeat. The training session ended with Thompson addressing the entire class about the importance of adapting to changing circumstances and never underestimating an opponent based on size or appearance. But Sarah could tell that something fundamental had shifted in how he viewed her. The skepticism in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked like professional respect. Over the following weeks, Thompson's approach to Sarah's training changed dramatically. Instead of trying to break her down, he began pushing her to excel. He gave her additional instruction after regular sessions, teaching her advanced techniques that weren't part of the standard curriculum. Sarah realized that his earlier harsh treatment had been a test, not just of her physical abilities, but of her mental toughness and determination. "You know, Martinez," Thompson said one evening as they finished an extra training session, "when you first walked into my class, I figured you'd wash out within 2 weeks. Small woman, tough neighborhood background. I've seen dozens like you who thought they could handle police work, but couldn't adapt to the structure and discipline." Sarah toweled sweat from her face and waited for him to continue. She had learned that Thompson often had more to say when he started conversations this way. "But you proved something important that day when you put me on my back," he continued. "You proved that you don't just have physical skills. You have the mindset of a survivor. That's something I can't teach. Either you have it or you don't, and it's more important than any technique I could show you." The respect was mutual. Sarah had come to understand that Thompson's tough approach came from genuine concern for the recruits who would soon be facing life-and-death situations on the street. He had seen too many officers get hurt or killed because they weren't properly prepared, and his harsh training methods were designed to expose weaknesses before they became fatal flaws. As graduation approached, Sarah's reputation had spread throughout the academy. The story of her takedown of Sergeant Thompson had been embellished and retold countless times, growing more dramatic with each telling. But the real impact was more subtle. Her fellow recruits had stopped seeing her as the weak link in their class and began treating her as an equal. On graduation day, Sarah stood with her class as they received their badges and took their oaths as sworn police officers. Her mother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter achieve something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But the real validation came afterward, during the reception, when Thompson approached Sarah with a serious expression on his face. "Martinez, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I want you to know something," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "That move you pulled on me, the pressure point and the follow-up, that wasn't luck. That was years of training and the ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. Those are the qualities that separate officers who have long careers from those who don't make it through their first year." He paused, looking around the room at the other new graduates, celebrating with their families. "I've trained over 800 officers in my career," Thompson continued. "Maybe 30 of them had what it takes to be truly exceptional. You're one of them, and I want you to remember that when you're out there questioning whether you belong." Sarah felt a surge of emotion that she hadn't expected. Throughout the academy, she had focused so intensely on proving herself that she hadn't realized how much Thompson's approval meant to her. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say. "Your training saved my life before I even got to the street." Thompson smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually stern features. "No, Martinez, your training saved your life. I just gave you the opportunity to show what you were made of." 6 months later, Officer Sarah Martinez was walking a foot patrol in one of the city's most challenging neighborhoods when she encountered a situation that would test everything she had learned. A domestic violence call had gone sideways, and she found herself facing an armed suspect who was high on drugs and completely unpredictable. The man was twice her size and wielding a baseball bat, threatening to hurt anyone who came near him. Sarah's backup was still minutes away, and there were civilians in the area who could be injured if the situation escalated further. Drawing on everything Thompson had taught her about reading an opponent and using their aggression against them, Sarah managed to de-escalate the immediate threat. When the suspect finally charged at her with the bat, she used the same principles she had applied in the academy: timing, leverage, and commitment to technique over brute force. The suspect ended up on the ground, disarmed and in custody, without serious injury to himself or anyone else. As Sarah waited for backup to arrive, she thought about that day in the academy when Thompson had challenged her to prove she belonged. The lesson she had learned wasn't just about fighting or self-defense. It was about refusing to be defined by other people's expectations and having the courage to prove your worth when everything was on the line. When Thompson heard about the incident, he wasn't surprised. He had seen something in Sarah that day when she put him on the training room mat, the rare combination of skill, intelligence, and unbreakable will that made the difference between good officers and great ones. Years later, when Sarah had become a sergeant herself and was training a new generation of recruits, she would often think about the lesson Thompson had taught her. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about proving you're stronger than your opponent. They're about proving you're stronger than your own fears and limitations. The story of the small recruit who took down the big sergeant became academy legend, told and retold to new classes as an example of what was possible when preparation met opportunity. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the takedown itself. It was the moment she realized she had the courage to stand up and fight for her place in a world that had tried to convince her she didn't belong. That confidence would carry her through a distinguished 25-year career in law enforcement, during which she would become the first woman to command her department's tactical unit and eventually rise to the rank of deputy chief. But it all started with that moment in the academy, when she decided that being small didn't mean being weak, and that the size of her heart mattered more than the size of her frame. The tables had indeed turned that day in the training room, but the real transformation wasn't physical. It was the moment Sarah Martinez fully believed in herself and refused to let anyone else's doubts define her future.